So welcome. We'll do tonight only one text. I think we have never done only one text that is that short. I just listened to it again on my drive over here. So I have a 25-minute drive, and there's an audio recording of it, and it's just 25 minutes long. And it struck me was, again, that the text is so immensely complex. And I'm standing here completely naked, and I don't know what the text means. I'm going to tell you that right off the bat. So that one of the things that we'll be doing tonight really is a close reading. But if you, I can offer to you again that we can launch right in, or I can give you my spiel.
Give us your spiel.
We're going to do the spiel.
We need the
All
spiel.
right? Yes. You need the spiel tonight. All right.
We need the key.
Good. I give you that.
We need the key. I'm looking for the key to the parable. We don't have it.
I think I have it. I have a couple of keys, I think. One of them actually just occurred to me now. You actually read, look for the bare bones. Okay, here's a man who writes a letter. He looks out the window, he delivers the letter, and then kills himself. Okay, so is the letter announcing his engagement a suicide note? All right, there we go. During the night of September 22nd to 23rd in 1912, Kafka writes The Judgment in a 7-hour session. It's a night of transformation, from which he emerges as the unsettling writer we know as Franz Kafka. Das Urteil, as you know, The Judgment, is really the first sustained effort that he made, or that he succeeded in completing, that uses his mature style, and we'll be looking later in our interpretation when our reading of The Judgment, what does it mean, Kafka's mature style? What really does it mean to write in a Kafkaesque way? So Das Urteil, The Judgment, really is the first story in which we see Kafka's Kafkaesque style emerge. What are the features of that? That will be our work for tonight. Kafka's work is considered indecipherable and indeterminate, which hasn't deterred professors and critics, of course, to produce hundreds of interpretations, because there is something magical and something addictive about Kafka. Most people feel that he's onto something deep about modern individuals, their lostness in an empty universe, their disconnectedness from others, and a profound sense of guilt and despair. My sense, by the way, is that this current generation of 20-somethings is very far away from Kafka's world. Maybe there's one or two 20-somethings, but you can see this Kafka session is not mobbed. In my own time, a Kafka session would have been mobbed by 20-somethings, but the culture has moved away, and Kafka is no longer encapsulating today the problems that we consider modern. That too will be something that we need to discuss. Kafka's work is experienced as unsettling, certainly by our generation. One never quite knows where the rational world ends and the irrational world begins. Every detail in his stories seems to mean something. Why is Georg Lendemann's friend in Russia? Why is the father playing with the son's touches? Why does the fiancé say, with such friends, you never ought to have gotten engaged? What do these details mean? And why are we rushing to make them mean something? About his first great work, The Judgment, Kafka wrote to Felice Bauer on June 2nd, 1913, Findest du im Urteil irgendeinen Sinn? Ich meine irgendeinen geraden, zusammenhängenden, verfolgbaren Sinn. Ich finde ihn nicht, und ich kann auch nichts erklären. Do you find any meaning in the judgment? I mean, any straightforward meaning that hangs together and can be followed in its evolution? I can't find it, and I cannot explain anything in that story. That's Kafka on June 2nd, 1913. 4 days later, on June 10, 1913, he wrote to Felice, Das Urteil ist nicht zu erklären. The judgment cannot be explained. Kafka continues, vielleicht zeige ich dir einmal ein paar Tagebuchstellen darüber. Die Geschichte steckt voll Abstraktionen, ohne dass sie zugestanden werden. And here's the key. Maybe I will show you some diary entries about it. The story is full of abstractions without admitting to them. Der Freund ist kaum eine wirkliche Person. Ist vielleicht eher das, was dem Vater und Georg gemeinsam ist. The friend is hardly a real person. Perhaps he's more that which the Father and Georg have in common. Die Geschichte ist vielleicht ein Rundgang Vater und Sohn, und die wechselnde Gestalt des Freundes ist vielleicht der perspektivische Wechsel der Beziehung zwischen Vater und Sohn. Sicher bin ich mir dessen nicht. The story is perhaps a walk around father and son, and the changing figure of the friend is perhaps the changing perspective of the relationship between father and son. But I am not sure that it is so. So that's Kafka about his own story. Felice, who received these letters, must have been pretty puzzled. What is clear, though, is that Kafka's stories demand interpretation, and anyone familiar with Kafka's reflection about writing in his diaries realizes very quickly that writing for Kafka was not a matter of encrypting his own life in clever metaphors. He knew, of course, Freud's work, and he did not appreciate, was contemptuous of psychoanalysis. Writing was a matter of lifting an insight, a deep pre-logical apprehension, a begreifen, of the human condition that had accumulated in him into the clarity of language. That transition from perceiving and apprehending to comprehending and grasping to lifting into language was what writing was about for Kafka. And it demanded of him the entire person. In the spring of 1911, Kafka consulted a philosopher and esotericist, Rudolf Steiner, who attempted to find a synthesis between science and mysticism. We know him as the founder of the Waldorf schools. We know roughly how Kafka presented his own case to Steiner because he left a record of it in his diary. I feel that a great part of my striving is toward theosophy, but at the same time I have the greatest fear of it. That is to say, I'm afraid it will result in a new confusion which would be very bad for me, because even my present unhappiness consists only of confusion, Verwirrung. This confusion consists out of just this, my happiness, my abilities, and every possibility of being useful in any way have always been in the literary field. And here I have experienced states, though not many, that, in my opinion, correspond closely to the clairvoyant states, Hellseherische Sehen, described by you, Dr. Steiner, in which I completely dwelled in every idea, but also filled every idea, in which I not only felt myself at the limit, an der Grenze, but at the limit of humanity, an der Grenze des Menschlichen. So when he inhabits these states, he feels how he's pushing at the Grenze des Menschlichen, the limit up against the limit of humanity, of being human. Only, he continues, the calm of enthusiasm, die Ruhe der Begeisterung, which is probably characteristic of the clairvoyant, was still lacking in those states, even if not completely. A typical Kafka kind of formulation. He says something and then he almost takes it back, but not entirely. So only the calm of enthusiasm, die Ruhe der Begeisterung, which is probably characteristic of the clairvoyant, was still lacking in those states, even if not completely. I conclude this from the fact that I did not write the best of my work in these states. I cannot now devote myself completely to the literary field, as would be necessary, and now comes another clue, for a number of reasons. Apart from my family situation, I could not live by literature because of the slow maturing of my work and its special character. I have therefore taken a job in a social insurance company. Now, these professions cannot tolerate each other and allow no mutual happiness. The smallest happiness in one becomes unhappiness in the other. So here's the key. From this very early passage in his diaries, when Kafka was 27 years old at the time, we learn several important things. The first is that Kafka wrote in a state of deep and total concentration, in which he achieved almost a state of trance, which he calls clairvoyance, hellseherisch. And that means, second, what is always primary in Kafka's work is that which he sees. Images come to Kafka first. Writing for Kafka is to translate what he sees, perceives, apprehends, grasps, experiences. Very hard to know really what that is, this pre-language apprehension of what he thinks he needs to say. So what writing for Kafka is to translate that which he apprehends in a dream state, in an almost holistic physical experience, into the linearity of language, which is a completely different medium with a different kind of logic. And he describes this process many, many times in his diary. For this translation process, his writing, he needed total quiet. Kafka was notoriously sensitive to noise and movement around him, and he ended up devising a schedule for himself that allowed him to write in the depth of night when the rest of his family was asleep. Now notice that Georg Bendemann writes in the clear light of day. It is an early Sunday morning in spring, and the light is shining, and it's all sunny. So is that writing. Most important is that Kafka experienced these writing sessions as the core of his self. When those sessions went well, he experienced complete happiness, a state of absolute bliss. This was the case for the first time in the night of September 22nd to September 23rd, when he managed to write down the judgment in one sitting. Going to the office meant interruption. It meant losing his focus, his concentration, his grip on what he was seeing. It meant that he had to burrow back into himself and retrieve what he had been seeing, which was a tremendous effort. The prose pieces matured inside Kafka over a long period of time, but not in the form of language. Kafka's diaries are full of descriptions of what it takes to write, and about writing as the deepest expression of his own selfhood. The clearest formulation is a diary entry that probably dates to January 3rd, 1912. In me, a concentration toward writing can be clearly observed. When it became clear to my organism that writing was the most productive direction of my nature, everything rushed toward it and left other abilities empty that had first aimed toward the pleasure of sex, of food and drink, of philosophical thought, of music. I became thin in all these directions. Magerte nach all diesen Richtungen abmagern, Hummerkünstler, and you already see what semantic fields are at play here. I became thin in all these directions. Ich magerte nach all diesen Richtungen hin ab. This was necessary because the sum of my powers was too small, so that only if they were bundled all together and could they halfway serve the purpose of writing. Of course, I did not seek that purpose independently and consciously. It arrived by itself, and it is currently impeded only, but fundamentally, by the office. In any case, I must not bemoan the fact that I cannot tolerate a lover, dass ich keine Geliebte ertragen kann, that I understand as much about love as about music, which is nothing, that I have to be satisfied with the most superficial experiences of their effects, that I had black roots, Schwarzwurzeln, and spinach for New Year's dinner, accompanied by 8 ounces of fruit juice, and that I couldn't participate in Max's reading of his philosophical work. The compensation for all this is obvious, liegt klar zutage, klar zutage. All that needs doing then is to throw the office work out of this community, since my maturation, meine Entwicklung, is complete, and there is nothing to sacrifice anymore as far as I can see, in order to begin my real life, during which my face can age naturally as my work progresses. So that's Kafka about writing, January 3rd, 1912. So you would think that what Kafka posits here, and does also in other diary entries, is an outright antithesis of his outside life and his inside life, of his work and family life and his writing. On the one hand, there's the writing process, which is tied up with the core of Kafka's self, and on the other hand, There's a life around Kafka, especially the office and the family, with the huge demands on his time, which obstruct the unfolding of himself in the writing process. The reality is, of course, much more complex, because Kafka's writing life is sustained and feeds on the life that is around him. The family and the office are like a teeming compost heap out of which his work grows. I want to return to the letter that Kafka wrote to Felice on June the 2nd, 1913, in which he asked Felice if she could find any meaning in the judgment. He goes on about the meaning of the names in the story and how it only occurred to him afterwards that they could be seen as encrypting his own name. Bendemann is the same structure as Kafka, with the two vowels followed by following a consonant and having a double consonant in the middle. He points that out, and Mann says it's a reinforcement to help this weak Bender to actually be a man. So he has all these really funny interpretations of these names, but as he says, it really occurred to him only afterwards that they could be seen as encrypting his own name and that of Felice. And he adds that he wrote the story between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. after a Sunday spent in despair. And then and I now quote directly in actual translation I did. When I sat down to write, I planned, after a painfully unhappy Sunday, I had spent entire afternoons circling mutely around my brother-in-law's relatives who were visiting us for the first time. I planned to describe a war. This is about the judgment. I planned to describe a war. A young man was supposed to observe from his window a throng of people coming across the bridge, but then everything turned under my hands. The family and the office were impediments to the writing, although perhaps also necessary in some way. But Kafka's friends were clearly enabling, most of all Felice. On September 20, Kafka had, and that's 1912, Kafka had written his first letter to Felice in Berlin. He had met her on August 13, 1912, at the home of his friend Max Roth, to whom she was related. Eventually, Kafka would write 511 letters to her to span the years 1912 to 1917, which were also his most productive and creative years of writing. Writing to Felice, and even more important, receiving detailed letters from her, became an absolute existential necessity for Kafka. His letters are magnificent. I find them soft, I find them sweet, I find them desperate, and I find them very, very gentle, almost feminine letters. They are absolutely extraordinary in their tone. They are never aggressive, never challenging. They are like pieces of chocolate that you want to indulge in. They're extraordinary letters. The letters established the relationship. Kafka wooed Felice through these letters. He willed the relationship into being through his writing. At the same time, the letters were another medium of self-articulation. Between 1912 and 1917, Kafka wrote hundreds of letters, the diary, and a large number of his extraordinary stories. The letters he wrote and received, and the Felice these letters created, provided Kafka with an alternative world and with a kind of emotional life support. They were the world in which Kafka was safe from his father and from his family. Kafka's Felice, rather than writing, was the real antithesis to his family. And as I was writing the sentence and I was going over and practicing the talk and knowing where to breathe and all this, as all performers actually do, it occurred to me that the sentence is wrong. So I'm actually claiming that the letters he's writing and that the Felice he's created were the real antithesis to the father and the family, and I think that's not wrong, because I think that is wrong. It's not wrong, and it's also wrong because Felice too participated in the practical world, but there was another kind of Felice. There were really two Felices in his life. I think that ultimately, if I'm really honest with myself, I think that writing was really the only antithesis to the world of the father. But I was claiming then when I was writing this that it is Felice and the letters, and I think to some degree it's true, provided an escape from his imprisonment at home. And as I'm reading this sentence to you now, provided an escape of his imprisonment at home, of course, I took this formulation from the Judgment. You remember that the friend almost escaped to Russia. So there are keys, as you're thinking about Kafka and you're playing with things, you move into his writing, but it's a very slow process. So before we launch into our interpretation of the Judgment, I'll say just a little bit about Kafka's actual family situation, and I will end with 2 diary entries about his father that are very strong diary entries, and that will launch us into our interpretation of the Judgment. So Kafka was born into an assimilated German-speaking Jewish family in Prague. His father, Hermann, 1892 to 1931, the same year that Arthur Schnitzler died, was described by Kafka as a true Kafka in strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, endurance, presence of mind, and knowledge of human nature. Hermann Kafka was the 4th child of Jacob Kafka, a butcher, and came to Prague from Osek, a Jewish village near Písek in southern Bohemia. After working as a traveling salesman, he established himself as an independent retailer of men's and women's fancy goods and accessories, Galanteriewaren, employing about 15 people and using a jackdaw, Kafka, as his emblem. Kafka's mother, Julia, 1856 to 1934, was the daughter of Jacob Löwy, a prosperous brewer in Podjebrady, and was better educated and more refined than her husband, but in her marriage completely accepted her husband's patriarchal authority. Kafka was the oldest of 6 children. He had 2 younger brothers, Georg and Heinrich, who died as infants before Kafka was 6 years old. He had 3 sisters, Gabriele, Ellie, 1889 to 1941, Wally, 1890 to 1942, and Ottilie Ottla, 1892 to 1943. As you can guess from the years of their deaths, 41, 42, 43, the sisters died in German concentration camps. Ellie and Wally were sent to Lodz Ghetto, and Ottla is believed to have been sent to Theresienstadt and from there to Auschwitz. It's absolutely horrifying to me to think that if Kafka had not died in 1941, that might have been his fate too. There's actually a diary entry in the year 1911 in which Kafka noted that he did not expect to live to age 40, and he died. He actually died at age 41. Kafka's first language was German, but he was also fluent in Czech, and he later acquired French. And Flaubert turned out to be was one of his favorite authors. He met 2 to 3 times a week with Max Brod, and they read Flaubert's work out loud in French. Flaubert is probably the writer I think is that Kafka learned the most from. He owes, I think, owes him a tremendous debt into thinking about what literature is and how one can transform reality into just language. Kafka attended an elementary school for boys in the center of Prague. He had a superficial Jewish education that ended at age 13, and he attended a very rigorous, classics-oriented Altstädter Deutsche Gymnasium in the Kinsky Palais, where his father later had a store. He completed the gymnasium in 1901 and enrolled in Karls University, first in chemistry and then in law. Switching to law opened a range of career choices for him and displeased Kafka's father, but also had the added advantage that it was a longer course of study, which gave Kafka an opportunity to take courses in German and in art history. At the university, he joined a literary club, and there he met Max Brod, who would become his close and lifelong friend and literary executor. Brod absolutely adored Kafka, and he knew very early on that Kafka was brilliant and sui generis, and therefore did not execute Kafka's last will, asking him to burn his work, which is why we have it. In 1906, Kafka graduated with a degree in law and performed the obligatory year of unpaid service as a law clerk at civil and criminal courts. On November 1st, 1907, he entered Assicurazione Generali, an aggressive Italian insurance company which required Kafka to be in the office from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. That actually was not unusual in private industry at the time. Kafka toughed it out, and for 8 months, and then on July 15, 1908, switched to the Workers' Accident Insurance Company for the Kingdom of Bohemia, and he was a conscientious and scrupulous employee who was esteemed by his superiors and respected by colleagues, and he was very quickly promoted to a position of real responsibility with excellent pay and manageable office hours, which ran from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. So by 2 p.m. he actually was a free man. Nevertheless, despite his good pay, Kafka continued to live at home, although he hated his room. On November 11, he wrote in his diary, and this goes to Noyes and to his room, and this was really a well-off young man. I sit in my room in the headquarters of the noise of the whole apartment. I hear all the doors slamming. Their noise spares me only the steps of the people running between them. I can still hear the oven door banging shut in the kitchen. My father bursts through the door to my room and passes through, his robe trailing. The ashes are being scraped out of the stove in the next room. Vali asks, shouting one word over the other through the foyer, whether father's hat has been cleaned yet. A hushing sound that aims to be friendly to me raises the screech of a voice in reply. The apartment door is unlatched and makes a grating noise like a scratchy throat, and then opens wider with the singing of a woman's voice, and finally closes with a dull, manly bang, which is the most considerate sound of all. Father is gone. Now the subtler, more diffuse, more hopeless noise begins, led by the voices of the two canaries. I had been thinking about it earlier, and with the canaries, it now occurred to me again that I might open the door, a tiny crack, slither into the next room like a snake, and that way, on the floor, ask my sisters and their governess for peace and quiet. Oh, this is actually a very funny text. Yeah. And it shows just how keenly, how astutely, how closely he observes. It's absolutely extraordinary. And that, too, is one of the phenomena of his style. Kafka actually published this piece in a journal in 1912 for, and I quote, the public flogging of his family, which shows that the diary, of course, was a receptacle for his literary work. Between 1912 and 1917, Kafka was courting Felice Bauer, an employee of a dictaphone company in Berlin, and he was engaged to her twice, and before the relationship was finally broken off in December 1917. In 1917, incidentally, he also began to suffer from tuberculosis, which required frequent absences from work, and Kafka's family was supporting him all the way through. In the early 1920s, Kafka became interested in Milena Jesenska, and they exchanged also quite extraordinary letters. In 1923, Kafka moved to Berlin, where he lived with Dora Diamant, a kindergarten teacher from an Orthodox family. He began to learn Hebrew. Someone told me 2 days ago that his Hebrew notebooks are currently on display in Jerusalem, so it's just a little hike, across the Atlantic, but they can be seen there, and they're also actually exquisite. He also pursued his interest in Talmudic studies, which had always been there. And he was already quite sick in 1923, and he died on June 3rd, 1924, in a sanatorium near Vienna. Kafka left about 40 completed prose texts, and the work that Kafka regarded as finished comprises only 350 pages in print. In addition, there are 3,400 pages of diary entries and literary fragments and 1,500 letters, and Kafka himself destroyed hundreds and hundreds of manuscript pages, especially things written before the judgment from 1910 to 1912. The least tolerable presence in Kafka's life was probably his father. In this, he was not alone in his generation. Florian Illies, in his book of 1913, delineates the extent to which the years before World War I were marked by intense generational conflict. And I'm just going to read a very short section from Florian Illies' book, because I also put on our program that we'll be talking about Gottfried Benn, so this 1913. I'll just give you a flavor the world in which Kafka was living, writing in 1913. So this is from Illies' book. The April edition of the Berlin magazine Die Aktion issued a call for the killing of the father for parricide, although the editor, Otto Groß, cannot possibly have known that in Vienna, Sigmund Freud was working on his own theory on the subject, which is Totem and Taboo, which we'll be reading later in the course. Groß writes an essay with suggestions for overcoming the cultural crisis. The most important is this: today's revolutionary, and this is a quote from Gross, today's revolutionary who, with the help of the psychology of the unconscious, sees the relationship between the sexes as lying in a free and auspicious future, struggles against rape in its most primal form, against the father and against the rights of the father. At the end of the year, Gross, quite seriously, ends up being committed to a psychiatric ward by his own father. This is the same moment when Asta Nielsen can be seen in the cinemas in the film The Sins of the Fathers, and Franz Kafka writes to his new publisher, Kurt Wolf in Leipzig, that he is thought of a title for his first collection of stories, Sons. Gottfried Benn's second volume of poetry, published in 1913, not by Kurt Wolf, but because Wolf doesn't like Benn's poetry, but by the small publisher Meyer in Wilmersdorf, is also called Sons. Small wonder then that on April 3rd in Hamburg shipyard Blom & Voss, the biggest passenger ship in the world of 54,282 gross tons and 276 meters in length, is christened and launched by the name Vaterland. Fatherland. Alright, so this is just a small nugget about fathers and killing fathers and sexual obsession with fathers where we're in the culture. And if you had a chance to look at Gottfried Benn's poems, Söhne, they are really, they're tough. They're extraordinary too. So, what is astonishing about Kafka, however, is that even when he's overcome by anger and feelings of hostility, he remains refined in his wording and completely controlled. And you can see that too in Georg. If you think about the judgment and Georg's reactions to his father's assault, he's very quiet. It's a very particular kind of reaction, as we will see. Kafka never lets fly. His revenge is to reduce his opponent through minute observation and description. He can diminish his father by describing how he reaches into his nose, which Kafka writes is actually not disgusting, unappetitlich, but that just makes it worse. I'll segue into our discussion by offering two of Kafka's diary entries about his father. In November 1911, Kafka noted, "So as not to forget it, in case my father will call me again a bad son, I'm writing down for myself that in front of relatives, be it just to oppress me, be it to supposedly save me, he called Max a Meshuggene Ritoch, a crazy hothead. And that yesterday, when the Yiddish actor Yitzhak Levy was in my room, he spoke with ironic shaking of his head and grimacing around the mouth about strange people that are being let into the apartment, and what interest could one possibly have in strange human beings, fremde Menschen, and why would one establish such useless relationships, and so on. I ought not to have written this down, because I have now written myself into a state of hating my father, for which he hasn't given me any reason today, and which, regarding Levy, is not in the right proportion compared to what I actually wrote down as my father's remarks, and which is increasing my hatred because I cannot remember the actual evil in my father's behavior yesterday." It's a very complex reflection about why he's hating his father and he oughtn't to, and what really ticks him off. About a month later, in December 1911, Kafka noted, and then I will ask your opinions about the judgment, "It is disagreeable, unangenehm, to listen when father, constantly pointing out the fortunate situation of all his children, talks about the suffering he had to endure in his childhood. Nobody denies that as a consequence of inadequate winter clothing, he had open wounds on his legs for years, that he was frequently starving, that as early as age 10 he had to push a wagon through the villages even in winter and even early in the morning. But these accurate facts do not permit, which is what he does not wish to understand, in comparison with the also accurate fact that I have not lived through any of this, the conclusion, so these accurate facts do not permit this conclusion, that that I was happier than he was, that he is allowed to be arrogant on account of these wounds on his leg, that I cannot appreciate his suffering back then, and that on account of my not having suffered in the same measure, I must be endlessly grateful to him. I think this is a very recognizable thing. Where parents said, oh my gosh, you know, I had it so bad right after the war, and you got it so good, why aren't you thankful? So it's a very classical structure here. I would very much like to listen to him talk incessantly about his youth and his parents, but to have to listen to it in a tone of bragging and quarrelsomeness is torturous. Time and again, he slaps his hands together and exclaims, who knows that today? What do the children know? Nobody suffered as much. No child today understands this. Today, he talked like this again to Aunt Julia, who had come to see us. She has the enormous face of all relatives on father's side. The eyes are incorrectly placed or colored by just a nuance. You see how he's observing, and that sort of cuts her down in size. At age 10, she was rented out as a cook. She had to go on an errand in the freezing cold in a wet skirt. The skin cracked on her legs. The skirt froze and dried only in bed at night. So that's my spiel. Okay, now we will do our usual thing, which is that I will ask a few macro questions. So, or not ask, but we'll ask you to give me a reading or what puzzled you or where we're going, and I'll see where you're thinking, and then we'll see if we can just go through the text and find out where, if there is enough for us to come up with an interpretation or make some sense of the judgment. So, floor is open for you. It's just impressions of reading, and Hirschhorn and short.
Yes, very short. I read it as the father-son struggle.
Father-son struggle, okay? Fair enough.
And he has pity for the father near the end.
He has pity for the father near the end. That's
yes.
very interesting.
Yes.
Yes, pity, he, Georg, yeah?
Yes,
yeah.
And he knows that he's gone the wrong way. Georg knows he's gone the wrong way. And his father points out to him that there are other things he could have done. And so this is a classic father-son.
Okay, classic father-son conflict. The father pointing out to Georg that he's that he has gone off a wrong path.
His girlfriend is getting married.
And you're also arguing that Georg feels sorry for his father at the end. Okay, wow, interesting. Hi.
I saw the whole thing as a theological. I saw the whole thing as a theological, a riff on the Bible and various other, Jewish stories, not just Jewish, other mythologies too.
Can you be more precise?
I see it much more that the Father is, if not God, then the deity, a deity against whom humans are struggling. But the thing is, you get to the end of that story and you don't know what is true. I think,
you no longer know what is true.
Has so distorted reality, and the language is so amorphous and so unspecific that you.
Did you read it in Deutsch?
No.
Okay, that might be an issue because the language is very clear. But by amorphous, maybe may I just clarify?
The tenses are very difficult. Moving from past to present to future, conditional tenses, back and forth. Hard to figure out, actually.
Let me just use another word for amorphous. Maybe because that amorphous might come in through the translation. The language is puzzling so that it calls for interpretation. You don't always know just what things mean, and it's not always logical. How one thing follows from another, and what the tenses are, and where we actually are situated, doesn't appear to be always crystal clear and logical. Right. So it's almost as if you're walking on a slanted floor, and you're not really sure where this is going. So you want to look more closely, and you want to make things mean something.
But the effect of it is, at the end of it, I'm thoroughly untrusting of Georg and everything he says and everything he does.
And you are thoroughly untrusting of Georg and everything he does, and that is exactly right. Okay, because this technique that we have is either who narrates this? Whose perspective do we have? And that's a very important observation already. How do we know what is true? And why do we have this sense? What's it? Who narrates?
Well, not really.
Well, not really.
I mean, it's told through his eyes, but we see him distorting truth.
There is a little bit of an omniscient narrator, because somebody's got to say at the end that the traffic was going over the bridge, right? And somebody is definitely narrating the opening paragraph, which is is as innocent as it always is in Kafka. It was like it was a beautiful Sonntagvormittag. Es war an einem Sonntagvormittag im schönsten Frühjahr. Georg Bendemann, ein junger Kaufmann, saß in seinem Privatzimmer im ersten Stock eines der niedrigen, leicht gebauten Häuser. Sorry, so this, if you have the English translation, that's just the first sentence. It gives you the situation. That's not Georg talking at this point. So we have this, but then, as soon as we go into the second paragraph, dachte darüber nach. He was thinking about his friend. From that moment on, we are only in Georg's mind. And we stay there to the very end. And everything we see is perceived through Georg, and we don't necessarily have to believe him, because he may say things he doesn't mean. He may say certain things in order to protect himself. And we get that impression, or I'm trying to draw it out a little bit more, because there are these extraordinary switches in how something is being perceived, especially the father figure, who moves all the way around, from being pleasant, to being weak, to being old, to being very powerful at the end. And it is not exactly clear why that is. So we must assume, if we have this pressure, and this is just something I want to state, we are so focused on having things mean something that we just rush to that. We must make it mean something, but we have this thing, but we need to deal with those switches. And one way in which we can save ourselves is by saying, well, sure, this is the monologue narrative that Kafka perfected. That you are in this limited personal point of view, and it's a stream, almost a stream of consciousness, but it is deceptively realistic. And that unsettles us. So there's a frame, okay, in omniscient narrative that opens the paragraph and that closes it. And we have a view of Georg looking in. And from that moment, we only have Georg, we're in Georg, looking out to the last sentence. But maybe I'm not right about that. Maybe that last sentence is also narrated by Georg. We can't know. That's not determined.
Well, but if the omniscient narrator is giving us the last sentence, we can believe him.
Yeah, but I just said I am not sure it's true.
So then maybe
oder wie Kafka sagen würde, as Kafka would say, bin da nicht ganz sicher. I cannot be sure.
Right.
It is possible.
Sounded like he killed himself.
But maybe not. Because he was a good sports. He was a very good sportler. He was good at sports. How do we know? Do you see him in the river?
No, he's describing the traffic as he descends. To
In diesem Augenblick ging über die Brücke ein geradezu unendlicher Verkehr. In this moment, which moment? Tremendous traffic was crossing the bridge.
You know what?
The only thing that we know, liebe Eltern, ich habe euch immer geliebt, das ist the sentence before. Dear parents, I have always loved you, und ließ sich hinabfallen, and let himself fall down. Okay, he actually comments on this word in a letter. We don't see him in the river. Okay, now you have another person, okay, who made a hasty escape. The friend. Okay, so I just want to eventually look at that too. Okay, so we have father-son conflict. We cannot be sure. We have changing perspective on the father, and we feel unsettled, but we are, because we are in a very linear world, and we think we're rational people with both feet on the ground. We want it to mean something, but we cannot be sure what it means. Now you go back to what I said about Kafka's mode of writing. and the various clues that are given. When Kafka writes, it is not about, and I think you're good about that, I can feel that you hesitate. Everybody, almost everybody, 90% of interpretations of this story, and there are 200 extant German interpretations of this, 200 just in German. I don't even want to count what is there in America. Okay, everybody interprets this, everybody in high school and everybody who's in the university, because Kafka is smart and you want to be smart, and so you interpret this. Okay, 90% of these are biographical. And it is very tempting to do that. And I can tell that you're hesitating because you know that I'll knock it down in a certain way. And Clive actually started us off at the highest already, because when you remember we were talking about the trial, certainly it's a metaphysical story. And there's a wonderful sentence actually in one of the letters that die Metaphysik ist zum Tode, that when you're thinking about metaphysics, you are always also thinking about death. Yes, and of course it's a story in which death figures in a big way. Symbolic death is death, but then what is death actually? What is it? So Kafka was thinking, I want to say something very trite, deep thoughts, I don't mean it, but it's the metaphor. It's a metaphor that Kafka uses when he sings. He goes down deep, in die Tiefe, and he wants to lift something. Yeah, but what? Is he thinking about the state of mankind? Is he thinking about God? Is he thinking about his, now Hegel or even Heidegger, geworfen sein in die Welt? He's being thrown into the world. What is it? So I think one of the mistakes that has been made in Kafka interpretation is that we have seen so far too strict a split between the world in which he lives and the writing that he does. I think that what we need to do is to see, and this becomes very clear when he writes in some of the letters he writes to Roth. There was an incident. Kafka's sister married a man also by the name of Hermann, I forget, Karl Hermann. And the father didn't want him. And Kafka said, you know, the guys, let him make an asbestos factory and let him be busy there, and he can use his talents and all of that. So he ran an asbestos factory, and he had to go on a business trip. And Kafka was now forced. He had just started America, the novel America. This is a little bit after he wrote the Judgments in October, and he goes on, has gone on a business trip, and Kafka is forced by his family to go to the asbestos factory after his work, and he just absolutely cannot take it. And he writes in the night of October 7 to October 8, basically a suicide letter to his friend Max Roth. And Roth is then so alarmed that by this letter says, you know, I'm actually going to jump into the river. It's actually almost a recurrence of this letter. But the point I want to make is that he says, you know, I had to choose. Either I'm not gonna go to this factory, and then I'm gonna have to stop writing, or I'm gonna have to kill myself, because I cannot just sit there and write. So it's either I'm standing at the window and I'm looking out and I'm contemplating this. And as you see, I'm writing you a Wiedersehensbrief, Wiedersehensbrief, I'm seeing you again, a reacquaintance letter, because I stepped back from the room and I'm back there because I actually couldn't do it. And he says, and the solution is that when I'm in the factory, this is the key, when I'm in the factory, I'm reeling in my novel. Because when I am in the family, I am in my literature. So I think that is a key to see that, in fact, it is not as clear separation, but that the pressures that he experienced in his real life, being here with his family, having the struggles that he alone, you remember the Verwandlung, when Sansa sees himself transformed in cockroach, seeing that he's utterly different from his family. I mean, he's not actually utterly different from everybody, utterly different from his family. His family is contemptuous, except for the sisters of him. And yet, what he experiences about human life, he can only experience from this family. Those are the things that he writes about. So it is true, there isn't a complete, or I'm not sure if it's true, but there isn't a complete separation between the writing and the family, but the emotions that are triggered in Kafka through his hatred, through his unhappiness, through his intensity, living in that family, make something about the human condition clear to him that he dives down to get deep in touch with, and which he then wants to lift into language. And I think if you think about the judgment in that way, that if you think about it as a story about the human condition, that we're being judged, or that we're going somewhere with our life, I think that might be easier than to get a handle on the story than if we think about it as a biographical one-on-one relationship. And that, of course, questions of theology, questions of how do you relate to the beyond. And is this really a death? But we don't see this death. What does it mean? I think it is time at this point that we look at, even though I looked at the clock, but it's not relevant, just need to pace myself a little bit, that we need to look at the structure. How many people are involved? Who is there? What are people? And of course I want to talk about Rasha. I want to talk about the friend, who's never named, by the way, or is he named? I don't think so, right? I have read this now 10 times, and there isn't any name, not that we need one. Okay, so who is there? But okay, so having said that the story might be about what ails humanity, about what ails a human being, what does it really mean to be alive? What are the struggles that we have, that he has, that Georg Bendemann has? Maybe, you know, that is a way of getting a handle on it, and that, of course, can change. We're not linear people. None of us is. We have. If you think about your parents, maybe not you personally, but if I think about mine, let's say, my father's not alive anymore. Let me think about my mom. You know, they're not always the same in relation to her. There are good days and there are bad days, and I think this and I think that. We'll leave it that way. And things can, you know, and sometimes, even in your relation to your loved ones, things can turn on a dime. And all of a sudden, you have just intense rage. And Kafka was capable of intense rage, but he was also capable of absolute and complete self-control. It's this letter to, just want to, I'm sorry I did not translate this into English, but I just want to read this to you. Is this okay if I do that? You want to? Okay, so this is the letter. I mean, because it is just absolutely stunning. So this is the letter, his suicide note that he wrote October 7 to 8, and that he sent to Max Brod. So he talks about that der Schwager, mein Schwager, der Fabrikant, ist, was ich in meiner glücklichen Zerstreutheit kaum beachtet hatte, heute früh zu einer Geschäftsreise ausgefahren. So my brother-in-law, who is doing this asbestos factory, is gone, and I did not actually notice it, that he's gone for 14 days and that he now has to go to this asbestos factory, he himself. And the reason is that there's only one person, a German, left in that family. And the Hermann Kafka, does not trust this German not to cheat him. Okay? So therefore, one from the family, a money giver, has to go there and just be there for this asbestos factory. And then he says auch in Abwesenheit des Schwagers, der in allen technischen und organisatorischen himmelweit überlegen ist, alles in der gleichen Ordnung führen konnte. Wie sonst denn? Schließlich sind wir Menschen und nicht Diebe. How else should this German really conduct himself in this factory? After all, we're human beings, we're not thieves. So then he goes on about how the mother is hacking him by vorwimmern. Sie wimmert. This is a very, I'm looking at you because you might be able to find a good word for that. It's like a whimpering or a moaning that Kafka needs to go, that the son needs to go to this factory. So she's passing on the pressure from the father that he needs to go to this factory. Whining, a kind of whining. Okay, and now. Darum handelt es sich auch für die nächsten 14 Tage nicht, für die ich ja nichts anderes nötig ist als 2 beliebige Augen, und seien es auch nur die meinen. In die Fabrik herumgehen zu lassen. It's no other matter. There's nothing else is at stake here. That any pair of eyes can just walk around the factory, but it's got to be mine. Dagegen, dass diese Forderung gerade an mich gestellt wird, there's nothing to be said against that this demand is made of me. Nicht das Geringste, denn ich trage nach der Meinung aller die Hauptschuld an der Gründung der Fabrik. Then everybody agrees on that it is my fault that this factory came into existence in the first place. Okay? Ich muss diese Schuld halb im Traum übernommen haben, scheint mir allerdings. But it seems to me that I took on this guilt, this Schuld, this debt, halfway in my dream. And außerdem ist auch niemand da, der sonst in die Fabrik gehen kann. And besides that, there's nobody really there who could be going to this factory because his parents, and he says, are really busy in the shop. Also als heute Abend die Mutter also wieder mit der alten Klage anfing, und abgesehen von dem Hinweis auf die Verbitterung und das Krankwerden des Vaters durch meine Schuld, auch die neue Begründung von der Abreise des Schwagers und der vollständigen Verlassenheit der Fabrik vorbrachte und auch meine jüngste Schwester, die doch sonst zu mir hält, mit richtigen, von mir in der letzten Zeit auf sie übergangenen Gefühl, mich vor der Mutter verließ und mir die Bitterkeit, ich weiß nicht, ob es nur Galle war, durch den ganzen Körper rann. Okay, sah ich vollkommen klar ein, dass es für mich jetzt nur zwei Möglichkeiten gab. Entweder nach dem allgemeinen Schlafengehen aus dem Fenster zu springen oder in den nächsten 14 Tagen täglich in die Fabrik und ins Büro des Schwagers zu gehen. Meaning, okay, when the mother pointing out how the father had become sick through meine Schuld on my account, and because the Schwager, the in-law isn't there, and my sister also deserted me, that I had to go because I am the only one to this factory, and my sister deserted me, betrayed me, I felt it run through me, bitterness. I felt bitterness run through me, and I saw with complete clarity that there are only two options for me. Either after everybody went to sleep, I jump out of the window, or for the next 2 weeks, I go to this factory. Ich bin also nicht heruntergesprungen. But you see, from this letter, I did not jump down. And also the temptations, I'm just translating, auch die Lockung in diesem Brief, einen Abschiedsbrief zu machen, and also the temptations to make this letter a goodbye letter. My thoughts about this letter really go into a different direction, meaning, you've got to help me. The temptations are not very strong. I stood for a very long time at the window and pressed myself against the glass. And very often I was tempted, es hätte mir öfters gepasst, it would have been suitable for me, den Mauteinnehmer, the toll collector on the bridge, to terrify him with my jumping. Aber ich habe doch die ganze Zeit mich zu fest gefühlt, but I felt too firm, too much a real human being, too firm, festgefühlt, to decide that I should splatter on the pavement below. And this sense that I ought to shatter on the pavement below ist nicht in die richtige, entscheidende Tiefe eingedrungen. Did not reach deep enough down to me. Okay, so he feels that he is too much of a human being, not yet a Hungerkünstler, not yet ethereal enough. And now he says, es schien mir auch, dass das am Leben bleiben, and that goes to perceptions of that. It also appeared to me that remaining alive, continuing will disrupt my writing much less than if I died. Almost as if death could just be also an interruption. That between the beginning of the novel and its continuation in 2 weeks, I will move in the factory and I will have parents who are content. And this means that I will really move inside the deepest core of this novel. And here is the smoking gun for how he sees the life around him and the factory connected to the writing. in some deeply. And then he says, you know, ich bin, also wollte ich, and this is a wonderfully charming sentence, and I'm just reading it to you in German. Ich lege dir, mein liebster Max, das Ganze nicht vielleicht zur Beurteilung vor, denn darüber kannst du ja kein Urteil haben. I'm not presenting this to you so that you could judge it, because you really cannot really have a judgment about this. Aber da ich fest entschlossen war, ohne Abschiedsbriefe nun dazu zu springen, but since I had actually decided to jump without writing you a letter, because one is allowed to be tired right before the end. So now that I have stepped back into my apartment as an inhabitant of my room, I wanted to write you einen langen Wiedersehensbrief. I wanted to write you a Wiedersehensbrief at this moment. I mean, it's an utterly charming letter, and that letter, really a suicide note, Alain wrote so much that he went to the family and said, okay, you guys, you cannot do it, and Kafka didn't have to go. Okay, now it seems almost as if 1 month, and this goes to Kafka's thinking, 1 month after he wrote the Judgment, he actually lived it, was prepared to live it, and did not jump. And that gave me pause to really think about Georg's escape, das Flüchten, as he runs out, very much in the way that the friend flees. Okay? I want to really, I'm pushing you to the friend. I've tried this already. Okay, let's talk about this friend to whom he is writing this. Why is he in Russia? I mean, we have 4 people. We have Georg, and the friend from his youth, and we have Frida Brandenfeld, who actually says something. She's actually there. I mean, in fact, he writes the letter, okay? We get a flashback, and he fills us in on the news on why he is writing this letter. Then we see him again at the window, and then he stands there, he wrote the letter, he looks out. There's actually certain things that are not logical. It's on the 2nd floor. In German, erster Stock is really 2nd floor. Okay, it's on the 2nd floor. And yet, he sits at his desk and looks out. And yet, there is a person walking out, and as he's looking out, he's so entranced, this is the omniscient narrator, that he isn't reading it. It's not logical. Okay, because no one who's when you're on the 2nd floor, there's someone walking down on the street level, cannot see you, and certainly cannot read or cannot recognize that you are not reading him back. So we already know that we are in a world of perceptions rather than in a world that is real. Real is only the window and the river outside, and we cannot even be sure that the Father's world, that the Father is actually real also. What happens, the only thing that we know that happens is he writes a letter, he thinks about the letter, he sends the letter, and he leaves. That's really all that we know. Okay, so what's the story? Oh, okay, so we have Georg and his friend. We have Georg and Frida, to whom he had gotten engaged months ago. And we have a flashback where they're talking about the friend, and Frida says to him, with such friends, if you have such friends, you ought not to have gotten engaged. That should, pick up with you. What does this mean? This has got to be something. He's sending it as a signal here, because it's not logical that she would say that. And we have this father figure of whom we get different perceptions, who is either weak, ein altes Kind, which is actually said also, ein altes Kind, an old child, is said of whom? When Georg speculates about what he should write to this friend in Russia, it's in Petersburg, he says, what can I write to him? And he speculates, should I ask him to come back? And when he comes back, he will be uncomfortable because he will be so alienated from everything, and he will feel like an altes Kind, because everybody will tell him what he should really do, because he's a nothing, and because he's infantilized. He comes back and he's infantilized, an altes Kind. And then later you see the father exactly like an altes Kind, because he carries him at his chest, and then he plays with the watch chain. Wow, I mean, the watch chain and the father and the watch chain, Saturn, Kronos. Okay, we should look at the Christianity. Have you noticed that when he runs out on the staircase, going down. Okay, so
The
again,
housekeeper says, "Oh, Jesus."
a servant comes and says, Jesus, and what does she do?
Covers her face.
She covers her face because in the presence of the Godhead, you don't look. Okay?
And actually, on that same point, I mean, these are just little pointillist things,
Yeah.
but how about the wound in the father's thigh?
The wound in the father's side, eine alte Kriegsverletzung. Yes, of course. Are we
So-
allowed to sing Isaac? I know which one is the one,
To
yeah.
me, it's Abraham and Isaac, although it's so convoluted and involuted that he's...
The wound in the side, but he's also, this is the moment when he's pulling up the skirt and he's accusing his sons of lecherousness, okay? And so this is a very sexual passage here. The
But
wound in
there's
the
another-
side, maybe it's a little bit higher up.
There's another... Okay.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Um,
Okay, now we're doing the bad stuff that everybody does, but I think we need to do it, just spit it out, okay? All those things. Everybody has ideas what something could mean. A good Kafka interpretation will then make all of these things mean something. Okay, you can't just pick and choose, but it's okay to spit it out.
I can't match it together, but the wound in the thigh
Right.
is very, very significant, and not just...
It's a wound in the Oberschenkel, okay, thigh.
But it could also be in Parsifal, you know, the wound that the Amphifortis
But
wound.
it's here, no?
No, it's in the thigh, and actually...
Oh, is it really?
And actually,
Wow.
it's a euphemism for castration.
Well, you know, obviously, because we have the watch chain, and we have Saturn, and we have Kronos, and of course that Kronos is emasculated by, I guess, the Titans or whoever comes afterwards, and that's the significance of the watch chain. Yes, we have elements of melancholia. Remember when we did Wahlverwandtschaften, elective affinities, we were looking at the tradition of melancholia that inscribed there, and Saturn and Kronos are being major presences, and of course the old war wound against the castration is definitely there, because of course the Father is disempowered, for God's sakes. Yes, and the Father is all of a sudden suddenly resurrected. Have you noticed the difference in rooms? One goes is on the sunny side, and this morning and all of that, he goes to his father's room and says, my gosh, it is so empty, it is dark in here, and it's also all enclosed, but it's a tomb. He goes to his father's tomb, and he carries the Father out of his tomb and offers him his own bed. He offers him resurrection. This is the return of the repressed. This is the return of the dead. This is a resurrection, and the Father takes it and goes back into power.
You missed out that he covers the Father. He buries
And the Father waits. Bin ich auch gut bedeckt? Okay, and he doesn't answer. And he insists on getting an answer. And only after this actually struck me most particular when I was driving over and listening to it again. Bin ich auch zugedeckt? After he wanted to cover the Father, bury the Father comes back with full force and says, Nein. And then he basically rises and is this towering figure. So we have all of this stuff that we will talk about in Totem and Taboo. Yes, at the same time, this is why I put this illustration, is that we have, everybody is thinking about what do fathers really mean, and are they powerful, or can they be killed, and what is the price for the killing of that. It's definitely here. It's not fully worked out. But if we are thinking about what is it that Kafka, why does he want to write? And if you think about what are the forces that make us unhappy as human beings, what are we afraid of? What are we scared of? Yes, fathers, fathers and mothers. Deaths, fathers, mothers, castrations, anxiety. I mean, it just horrors of some, and this towering. Remember when he first sees his father, by the way, there's also sacrificial offering. I mean, if you have an entire pagan shrine set up in this room, including the sacrificial offering from which the Father only eats a little bit, the breakfast that is standing there, which he then puts on the side. So that's the offering. So you are going into a pagan primeval world in which the Father reigns supreme, who is then resurrected and stands on this bed and says, look at me, he says to him, look at me. And he says, and he doesn't look. What does he do? He actually refuses, if you look at it, he refuses to engage his father. It's an absolutely tremendous scene. And in fact, he plays Woody Allen. Okay, if you go to, you don't have, this is the critical edition, you go to 2-3 pages from the end, okay? So this is where the father is. He actually calls him a comedian. Yeah. Komödiant. And when the father says, aber der Freund ist nun doch nicht verraten, but your friend hasn't, we still haven't talked about a friend, but your friend hasn't been betrayed, rief der Vater mit seinem hin und her bewegten Zeigefinger, bekräftigte but he hasn't been betrayed. This is how he stands there. Ich war sein Vertreter am Ort. And Riak says, Komödiant. Gosh, has any father who pretends to power ever been cut down like this with one word? Says, you're a comedian. You're just making this up. You're not that.
First, the father says, your friend doesn't exist. You make this up.
But that's...
Then the father comes back and says, I know your friend does exist. I know all about him. I've been in communication with him and I know the truth.
Okay, no. Und stand vollkommen frei und warf die Beine und strahlte vor eins. I said, no. Okay, the father said, aber schau mich an. So I'm going a little bit before that, just to get the chronology is very important. Aber schau mich an. Look at me, rief der Vater. Georg lief fast zerstreut zum Bett. Not focused, zerstreut. What's that zerstreut? Not terrified. Zum Bett, alles zu fassen, und stoppte aber in der Mitte des Weges, weil sie die Röcke gehoben hat. And then comes the display of the genitals and the wound and all that. Und stand vollkommen frei, das ist der Vater, und warf die Beine, und strahlte vor Einsicht. This is also like cutting down, and he was beaming with insight. Georg stand in einem Winkel, möglichst weit vom Vater. Georg is in a corner, far away from the father. Und vor einer langen Weile hat er fest entschlossen, alles vollkommen genau zu beobachten. Well, a long time ago, he had decided to observe everything very closely. Vollkommen zu beobachten, completely, vollkommen zu beobachten, von oben herab, nicht irgendwie auf Umwegen, nicht von hinten her, von oben herab überrascht werden zu kommen. He decided to observe everything very closely, very carefully, perfectly, vollkommen, so that he couldn't be surprised. That's his event. It is very clever. Georg Bendemann is not terrified by his father. Quite the contrary. He thinks he's a ridiculous figure. And the way in which he protects himself is that he steps back into his corner and he observes. And when the father says, oh, ich war sein Vertreter am Ort. I didn't have sex with this woman. I always think of that when I go like that. I'm flipping. Okay. Ich war sein Vertreter hier am Ort. Miss Lewinsky. Komödiant. I could say that. Komödiant. Okay, we have all seen this gesture, and we know that lady does protest too much. When someone goes like this, you want to say comedian. Okay, and that is precisely what he says. Ja, freilich habe ich Komödie gespielt, and so on and so forth. And now he says, now he is in his corner, and he says, jetzt wird sich vorbeugen, dachte Georg, wenn fiele und zerschmetterte. Now he's going to lean forward. If he fell and shattered, he's thinking of his father not as the God of the Jews. This is an idol. This is an idol. Only an idol that is made of clay can zerschmettern. That is the word that you use for something that shatters. If he now fell, tipped over, and shattered, this is not someone he's afraid of, and that's why I don't believe there's any suicide.
And in fact, the father might die. It's not clear the father doesn't die.
Oh, the father just is mit einem Schlag. Okay, let's go to the, so let's go, and then, okay, it goes, then the father, of course, is just tottering a little bit, but he's not falling and he's not shattering. And then he says, ich bin noch immer der viel stärker. I'm still the much stronger one. And then he says, the mother gave me her strength, and with your friend I made a connection. Ich bin ihm, as you said, ich habe mich mit ihm herrlich verbunden und eine Kundschaft habe ich in der Tasche. And that comes to Woody Allen. Okay, and this is how you can cut somebody down with just a sentence. Sogar am Hemd hat Taschen. Even in his shirt, it's got pockets. Okay, this is Portugal. Yeah, this is Jewish comedy right there. Sogar im Hemd hat Taschen, sagte sich Georg und glaubte, er können jetzt mit dieser Bemerkung ihn vor der ganzen Welt unmöglich machen. Okay, this is a well-known Jewish strategy. Okay, so famous joke. Actually, Weiss opens her book on Yiddish literature with that. It's a Jew is trying to do a border crossing from Russia into Austria. You know it's illegal. And he hears, and he's going to the forest, and he says, halt, or I shoot. And he says, are you crazy? Can't you see it's a human being? Okay, so what you do is you admit to your weakness, and you cut down the person, you diffuse tension with humor. And that is precisely what he does here. When you are terrified, and you can see this about yourself all the time, you're really terrified, you try to make a joke. When I'm terrified, you know, I've used this technique many times at home with my mother when I was still terrified of her. I'm trying to be funny, you know, because if you make somebody laugh, they're not going to hit you. And that's a technique that he uses here. And he uses it actually a second time. Only then he miscarries and says, oh, deinen Brief, der Knödel ungelesen in der linken Hand. Your letter sees, I don't know, der Knödel. Rumpling up in his left hand, while in the right hand he holds the letters that he's reading. You can see this is like an impossibility. He's just rumpling the hand, and with the right hand he holds the letters. And he says, er weiß alles 1000-mal besser, and your friend knows everything 1,000 times better. And Georg says, 10,001, 10,000 times. Okay, so it's that technique. This is not a guy who's terrified of this father, not at all. Now the question is, of course, why does he run out? I don't think that he jumps. I mean, yes, maybe he lets himself fall into the river. It's springtime, it's rejuvenation. Have you ever looked at all those?
You know what? It's Abraham and Isaac doesn't die. You know, who knows what happens at the end? But I think it's, you know, you can interpret it so many ways, but it seems to me equally likely that at the end of the story, the father's dead and the son continues to live and perhaps becomes a writer.
It is indeterminate that we simply can't know, and it really doesn't matter, because it's about states of sensation, it's about states of fears, it's about strategies of dealing with terror. It's a strategy of dealing with terror. Now, what about this friend? I mean, come on, guys, we only have 5 minutes. Yes, Anders.
Well, one way of looking at the friend is to say that the friend does what Georg doesn't do. So Georg, the friend takes off.
The friend takes off?
To St. Petersburg, into exile. He faces the cold and the aloneness and so on and so on. While Georg stays home, becomes very successful with the business, and eventually he is about to, it's a power play between him and his father. And the father has a point when he accuses Georg of wanting to take over the business, and so on and so on. But part of this is that Georg is very troubled by this friend.
Who's troubled by the friend?
Georg
is troubled by the friend. Of course he's troubled by the friend. And so is the father, yes.
We could do something as simple-minded as bad conscience, or perhaps a sense of responsibility.
Okay.
Taking this one crooked step further, and we could even say that what the father is after, this would make some sense. I don't know how.
Okay, so
yeah. What he's after ultimately is to have Georg face the truth.
Have Georg face the truth about what?
About the friend.
About the friend.
About, more importantly, about himself, what his reason for living is, what his goals are, what he as the son and so on should be, and actually isn't, to any extent at all. So when the father then goes through just what you described here, very dramatically, claiming the friend to be the ideal son.
Yes, he says, that's my son of mine Herzen.
After my
heart.
heart.
Okay.
This is, in a sense, driving the stake even deeper and making the point in a lethal way, you might say, because the son.
This friend is a very difficult friend to interpret. Okay, and we don't know, you said, what's the truth, and he wants to make him see the truth. We don't know what this truth is. It's a possible way of reading it. I am not reading it the way you do it. I hear what you're saying, and it's a possibility. I think it's a remote possibility, but that is because I have a particular perspective. So it doesn't mean that what I will now unfold might be truer than what you say, because it's a very strong statement. It's very hard to make sense of when the father says, "Er ist ein Sohn nach meinem Herzen." He's a son after my own heart. Very difficult to make, and I think that's a toughie. One has to look at carefully. That's Herr Hirschgrund.
Well, I just say that it's the person I should have been. This has to do with what his father might have said to him, or what he might have thought he should
This
have done.
other guy, she should have been the son.
Yes,
Okay.
he should have been the other guy.
But-
Yeah.
Well, when Georg, when Georg is describing the friend
Yeah.
in the letter
Yeah,
and talking about the friend's
Yeah.
difficult situation, a person who's alienated from his environment, who's uncomfortable with the German colony, who's
Georg
uncomfortable.
assumes that it is so. Let me just caution you, okay? Georg assumes that it is so. These are all Georg's speculation
Well, wait,
about
wait,
what the
I'm
friend...
saying something different. I
Ah.
think that Georg is describing himself. And he's
Ah.
talking about his own condition.
Ah.
So he's not assuming anything about the friend, whether the friend exists or not. He's talking about his own problems with how he feels about his own situation. Although the friend is symbolically a stranger in a strange land, Georg is a stranger in his own land, and he's also talking about his own engagement.
Okay.
I like that.
I think I can deal with this.
I
Okay,
can't
the-
support it with the text, but
that's a problem. Okay,
Well, I have
let me take what you said and
But
just
there are
and
lots of
just-
things
and
that you're
just
saying that can't be really supported with the text.
oh yes.
the other things that I said cannot
Like-
be supported by the text.
Yes, like when you say he didn't kill himself.
No, okay.
Because normally when you write, and now
In the text, it does not say.
it's seen.
Let me be very clear, because I'm very offended if I say something that's not supported by text. In the text, we are not told he's dead. I'm going to amend what I said to
Okay,
that.
but
Let me play with his thought, okay? Because I like what you said, but I just want to twist it a little bit, okay? Could we think, since this is a story about states of minds, okay? Could we just conceive of the friend? You know that Kafka too had two selves. He is in the world with his family and he goes in the factory, and he has a secret life. It's not so secret, and he has a separate life, which he keeps separate from his family. Okay? The way in which Russia and the friend are described, they are metaphors for his writing. Okay, when he goes, Russia is, and he says about this, Russia in a different diary entry, Russia is for him a metaphor for complete aloneness. And in order to write, the precondition for writing was for him to be completely alone. But even unsupported by this diary entry, it is possible to think of the friend just as you outlined, in fact, okay, as an alter ego for another state of mind of Georg. In fact, the friend is Georg, which is why when the father says, I don't believe you have a friend, he becomes embarrassed, because he, of course, is that friend. So the friend is a different form of Georg's existence, how he wants to be. And that friend did exactly what Kafka does. He runs off into a very far away place where he can be by himself and conduct his business. Everything that Georg says is only speculation about the friend. Okay? If he comes back, he's such and such. To be gone and completely gone and to conduct the business somewhere outside in an alien, as you say, these are your words, in an alien land, a stranger in an alien in a land, that was Kafka's ideal way of wanting to write. That's where he wanted to be. It's exactly right. He wanted to be, like you said that, in this other place. And let me finish my thought. And when he talks about, is he going to come to the wedding? He says four things, okay, that he comes to the wedding. I don't want to bother him because he would feel bothered, gestört und geschädigt. When Kafka needs to come back and go take care of the factory, okay, he feels gestört und geschädigt because he is taken away from the work that he really loves. That's the one he cares about. Why doesn't this friend come back for 3 years? Well, goddamn it, he could, of course, come back if he wanted to, but he doesn't want to. Okay?
But he also can't because he's not doing well.
That is, of course, because if you think about Kafka's, you're thinking now too literally. You don't take this literally. When Kafka thinks about writing, he's very often not doing well. Yes, the business, he thinks that if you think about it as a business, yes, of course, his business of writing very often isn't going well. And yes, he is struggling. Only sometimes it's going well, but yet he is doing it. It doesn't matter what it takes. Russia is the metaphor for the territory for writing, for the domain of writing. Okay, another example. Let me know, one more thought. Sorry, I'm going to, because of the time, I need to finish one more thought, actually 2 more thoughts. The next thought is, okay, when the father, and it's very strange, When the father rises up, okay, Georg, and says, and I'm the father and I'm the stronger, Georg thinks about his friend. It is absolutely strange. And he sees his friend. Georg sah zum Schreckbild seines Vaters auf. Georg looked up to the terrifying image of his father. Der Petersburger, next sentence, no transition, der Petersburger Freund, den der Vater plötzlich so gut kannte, ergriff ihn wie noch nie. And suddenly, this friend in Petersburg, whom his father claims to know so well, ergriff ihn, gripped him, as he had never gripped him before. Verloren im weiten Russland, lost in faraway Russia. An der Türe sah ihn, he saw him. An der Türe des leeren, ausgeraubten Geschäftes an. He saw him at the door of the empty, burglared store. Because at that moment, when the father asserts himself, he ruins the domain of writing and he burglars the store. There is no rational explanation, okay, that Georg all of a sudden, Georg all of a sudden sees his friend very clearly. That's not in the vision at the burglar store, because the father, in the very moment that he's rising, tries to smash the idols, or tries to smash that store. And that is the domain of writing. And he knows absolutely, with crystal clarity, okay, that if he goes back, the business in Russia is ruined, and that is the business domain of writing. And that is your key moment here, okay, that when the father rises, the store is destroyed. This is not, there's no realism here at all. Another thing, okay, then he says, okay, Father, but you know this friend. He has been in my room when you were there, and in fact, you listened to him. Metaphors for writing. Of course the friend is in the store when he is in Georg's room, because when he writes, and he reads stories out to his entire family. You listen to him. And not only that, you remember that the friend told stories about the revolution. And not just about in Kiev, okay? And then he talks about this cross that is cut into the hand, okay? These are stories. What are these stories? This is where your theology comes in, okay? What is die Zeitung? That I'm not interested in the news, he says, of course, because the father says he's interested in other kinds of literature. And what is Christianity all about? So he has this cross. It's a son who dies for the sins of you, for the Father, and is resurrected. And that is the domain of writing. You have to sacrifice yourself. You have to give up a life in order to be resurrected. If you're reading The Hunger Artist or whatever it is, or Ein Traum or whatever it is, always about, Hunger Artist is a good metaphor for that you diminish yourself so that everything you are, every physical shred of you, that's Kafka, gets abgemagert. Okay, magert nach allen Seiten hin ab, in order to just become the force of writing. And that is compared to this complete reduction of physicality to become just one thing. En arche ho logos. In the beginning was the word. Okay, that is what writing is about, John. Okay, so that is what it is about, and that we have, and that is called it's a revolution, because you deny the physicality in order to become spirit. And for that reason, the servant says Jesus when he goes. Okay, done. Sorry. Okay, 7:30 exactly.
In the Beatles column, it matches your description. It fits in exactly.
It fits. Gosh, you done it. Thank you very much. That's the greatest compliment you can pay me. It fits. All right. Sorry to have rushed over you, but I wanted to let you go. That was a good comment. I like that. Just